The forest of Velcroft did not welcome outsiders. Its trees grew tall as warships, their bark black as charred bone, their roots coiled above the soil like the fingers of something buried alive. The air tasted of iron and whetstone. Every species that had mapped this planet, the Dravosi surveyors, the Keth cartographers, the cold-eyed analysts of the Galactic Compact, had marked Velcrotha's equatorial jungle with a single annotation. Do not enter alone. Mara Ellison entered alone. She was not a soldier. She was not an explorer in any official sense. She was a xenobiological field researcher, 29 years old, from a small coastal town in New Zealand, stationed on Velcroft 4 for a routine soil microbe survey that was supposed to take 3 weeks and involve absolutely no apex predators. That plan dissolved the moment she heard the sound. It was small. Thin. Wrong in the way that only distress sounds are wrong, too high, too broken, too desperate for whatever body was producing it. Mara had spent 6 years recording alien animal calls. She knew the difference between a predator's ambush cry and the sound of something dying. This was something dying. She pushed through the undergrowth toward it. What she found was a veil. She recognized the species from the Imperial Taxonomy files, Velos imperanthus, the apex predator of 7 star systems, the sacred creature of the Kael'jari Empire, the animal whose image adorned their war banners and whose claws were ground into the ceremonial paint of their generals. They were enormous adults, 8 feet at the shoulder, 4 eyes, a triple-layered skull that could absorb a plasma bolt, and a loyalty structure that bonded them for life to a single companion. The cub at her feet was none of those things yet. It was the size of a large dog. One of its 4 eyes was swollen shut. Its left foreleg bent at an angle that made Mara's stomach clench. It had been left in a depression between 2 roots, not fallen, she realized. Placed. The earth around it was too deliberately cleared, the surrounding brush too evenly broken. Something had put it here. Something had decided it wasn't worth keeping. Mara crouched. The cub snapped at her, a reflex more than a threat, its tiny fangs clicking on empty air, and then collapsed again, sides heaving. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took off her field jacket, wrapped the cub as carefully as she could, and carried it back to her research station. She named it Joe. Not because it was a particularly alien name. Because on the night she found it, she was reading an old letter from her brother Joe back home, and when she looked up from her tablet at the small creature sleeping in a nest of thermal blankets, the name just stuck. The Kael'jari Empire found out 3 months later. The diplomatic channel opened without warning. Mara was in the middle of feeding Joe, who was now the size of a small horse and had recently discovered that her equipment cases made excellent chew toys, when her communications console lit up with a priority signal carrying the Imperial seal. She answered it with a piece of dried protein meat still in her hand. The face on the screen was not what she expected. She had anticipated a functionary, a diplomat, perhaps a legal officer. Instead, she found herself looking at Emperor Kael'zer himself. She knew the face from political briefings, the 4-eyed gaze, the crest of silver black along his skull ridge, the armor that was less clothing and more declaration. Kael'zer the Unbroken, they called him. 40 years on the throne. He had absorbed 3 attempted coups, 2 assassination attempts, and 1 economic collapse, and had emerged from each one looking slightly irritated rather than damaged. He looked slightly irritated now. Human, he said. His translator rendered the word with almost no inflection, which meant a great deal. You have in your possession a veil. I do, Mara said. That veil, Kael'zer continued, was a matter of imperial decree. It was abandoned by order of the Sacred Breeding Council under Provision 7 of the Imperial Purity Code, on account of its physical defect. Its survival was not sanctioned. Mara looked at Joe, who was watching the screen with enormous orange eyes and chewing thoughtfully on a corner of the thermal blanket. The leg healed, Mara said. Took about 6 weeks. She walks with a slight favoring of the left side, but the range of motion is almost full. There was a pause. That is irrelevant, Kaelzer said. The decree stands. The creature is to be. No, Mara said. The word landed in the channel like a stone in still water. On the screen, Kaelzer's crest rose slightly, the Kael'jari equivalent of someone sitting up very straight. You are aware, he said slowly, that you are speaking to the Emperor of the Kael'jari, whose dominion spans 14 star systems, yes. I did the briefings. Mara set down the protein meat. I'm a citizen of the Terran Commonwealth. Joe is on a Terran-leased research station on a planet under joint survey jurisdiction. She came to me in distress on Terran-surveyed land and I provided medical assistance. Under Commonwealth Wildlife Protection Codes, that makes her a ward of the station until the Commonwealth Council reviews her status. Another pause. Longer this time. You are citing bureaucracy, Kaelzer said, at the Emperor. I am citing law, Mara said, at the Emperor. There's a difference. The Kael'jari sent 3 warships. They parked them in orbit, very visibly, and a representative arrived at the station in full ceremonial armor and delivered a formal demand for the Veil's surrender. Joe bit through his ceremonial shin guard and he had to be helped back to the shuttle. The Terran Commonwealth, to their credit and mild embarrassment, backed Mara entirely. The legal case went to the Galactic Compact's Arbitration Council, where it spent 8 months being argued over by beings who had been arguing over interspecies law for centuries. Mara filed 17 documents, appeared in 6 virtual hearings, and, on one memorable occasion, brought Joe to a hearing as a material witness, which was not technically allowed but which nobody had ever specifically prohibited. The Empire did not send more warships. Partly because the legal case was genuinely not clear-cut. Partly because the image had already spread, a small human woman standing in front of a half-grown Veil, filing paperwork against an empire, refusing to yield, and empires are careful about the images they allow to define them. And partly, in ways that no one quite admitted, because Emperor Kaelzer watched the hearing recordings 3 times and each time found himself thinking about a provision in his own law that he had never questioned. A defect. A decree. A creature left in the dark. And a human who had heard it crying and walked toward it anyway. The Arbitration Council ruled in Mara's favor on procedural grounds. Joe was classified as a Commonwealth ward, a category that had been used exactly twice before in galactic history and never for an apex predator. The Empire accepted the ruling without comment. What happened next was not in any legal document. Emperor Kaelzer, in his 39th year of rule, quietly commissioned a review of Provision 7 of the Imperial Purity Code. The review took 2 years. The revision that followed was careful and narrow and worded in the dry language of imperial statute, but its effect was simple: the abandonment decree no longer applied to cubs whose defects were survivable. No announcement was made. No connection was drawn to the case of a Terran researcher and a cub named Joe. But people who watched the Emperor closely noticed that when the new provision was read aloud in the Imperial Council, Kaelzer sat very still. And when it passed, he did not celebrate. He simply nodded, once, and moved on to the next item of business. Joe lived for 41 more years. She grew to full size, larger than average, in fact, the healed leg having developed a slight compensatory musculature that made her left shoulder broader than her right. She was studied, occasionally, by xenobiologists who found her bond attachment patterns unusual. Veils bonded once, to one companion, and severed that bond only at death. Joe's bond was with a human woman from New Zealand who talked to her in English and sometimes Maori and occasionally swore at her in a way that the universal translator rendered, helplessly, as strong affection. When Mara Ellison died, at 83, Joe lay down beside her and did not eat for 9 days. She recovered. Veils were built to endure. But she was never, by any measure the imperial biologists used, quite the same after. In the Empire, they still tell the story. Not as a warning, exactly. Not as a lesson, in any simple sense. They tell it the way you tell any story about something that cracked something open in the world, quietly, with a kind of careful respect for the human woman who heard a small sound in a dark forest and, without hesitation, walked toward it. Emperor Kael'zer, asked once in his final years whether the incident had changed him, was silent for a long time. A human, he said finally, taught me that a creature's worth is not determined by whether it was deemed convenient to let it live. He paused. I should have known that already, he said. That is what haunts me.